This week, the famous French actor and movie director Gérard Depardieu officially gave up his French citizenship, went to Russia, and received a Russian passport directly from the hands of Vladimir Putin. Depardieu still lives in Belgium, but his paperwork defection is an attempt to avoid the top French income tax of 75%. He likes France, and France has given him opportunities, a career, a fabulous personal wealth, but he doesn't want to turn the majority of his income over to pay the bills for running France. His move is certainly being applauded by many tax revolutionaries, but you have to wonder how much of that wealth he would have if he had not been living in France and having been given the opportunities that he had in France. What if he had, for example, been an actor and filmmaker in Russia for the last 40 years? How well off would he be? It goes to one of the campaign issues of last fall when President Obama was quoted as having told business owners, "You didn't build that." And many people took to the media to shout out, "I did too build that," though they failed to mention that in the process of building that they had taken millions of dollars in federal loans, had depended upon hiring a workforce educated at public expense, had their product moved on roads paid for by public expense, and they were protected by police and firemen who were paid for at public expense, and yet they insisted that they built it all on their own with no help from anyone. Rather more quietly and without much media coverage, the author of the Harry Potter book and movie franchise, J.K. Rowling, has remained in Great Britain. She was a single mother on welfare when she wrote the first of the Harry Potter books. She sat in a coffee shop because the owners of that coffee shop would let her stay there all day and refill her coffee cup without extra charge. Rowling said, "When my life hit rock bottom, that safety net, threadbare though it had become under John Major's government, was there to break the fall. I cannot help feeling, therefore, that it would have been contemptible to scamper for the West Indies at the first sniff of a 7-figure royalty check. This, if you like, is my notion of patriotism." There is a line in our pericope from 1 Corinthians chapter 12 that's almost a throwaway line in our culture because, psychologically it's almost impossible to hear something that you don't understand. It's like trying to repeat a sentence in a foreign language that you don't speak. You can hear the sounds, but you don't make any conscious connection with it because it doesn't make sense to you. When someone talks about something that you don't know anything about, that doesn't meet with your personal experience, it tends to just glide right over the clean wax floor of your brain. You don't hear it, you don't remember it, you don't think about it. And I'm not just talking about my students in my university classes. It happens to the rest of us in other settings. Paul is talking to people in the church about their various talents, what he calls gifts of the Spirit. It's in verse 7, and I would like for you to indulge me, if you would, and just look in the bulletin at verse 7. He says, "To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good." Why do you have that talent? Why do you have IQ points that are so high? Why does business come naturally to you? Why were you able to turn your interest in science into a profession that has rewarded you well? Why do you have that? Paul says, and you can argue with Paul if you want to, I do regularly, but Paul says it's not just for you. It's for the common good. It's one of the things that I have often found myself at odds with the regular religious community, because most people in modern American Christianity talk about personal as if it were sacramental. Do you have a personal relationship with Jesus? Well, the word personal doesn't appear in the Bible, and the Bible is a big book. There's a lot of words in the Bible, but not in the Old Testament, not in the New Testament. The word personal doesn't appear. The spiritual communities that produced the Old Testament and the New Testament were concerned about community. We're concerned about the whole of the people. And that's why when there was national sin, that cycle of retribution, of exile and restoration in the Old Testament, it was the entire nation, that the people themselves had to pursue virtue, had to pursue justice, not just on an individual basis. Now, there's a personal dimension to your spirituality, certainly, but it's not private. Spirituality can be personal, but it's never private. It is always connected to others. The reason that this is such a throwaway sentence for us is because we have a much more visceral, real, and felt identification with Gerard Depardieu than we do with J.K. Rowling. There's only 1 year in my life that I made enough money to have a huge tax burden, and it just happened to be the year near the end of the Bush administration when they gave away an extra tax refund to everyone that had made under a certain figure, and it was the only year in my life that I had made more than that. So I hurt I had to pay so many taxes that year, and just felt a sudden imposition because that particular year's windfall, trust me, was earned. But I had to give a lot of it up. But you know, if you get past that immediate greedy sense of I earned this, this is mine, I deserve this, you become aware that the only reason we have anything is because of the community that we're in. If hard work is what determines wealth, then African American women ought to be the most wealthy people in the world. The sub-Saharan, I said African American, sub-Saharan African women carry water and firewood every day of their lives, and they ought to be millionaires. So it's not about hard work or ingenuity. It is about the circumstances in which you carry out your hard work and ingenuity. Now, certainly, sloth is not to be applauded. Irresponsibility is not to be applauded. There is a dimension in which you work within a setting of opportunity to make things happen, but none of us should ever feel that we did that ourselves. And I can be as irritated by lazy people who have an entitlement disorder as anyone. But do you remember last fall when Mitt Romney talked about how much it damages children to only have one parent, and how many problems came out of those one-parent children, and you realize that he was running against a guy who was raised by a single mom and who had welfare, and the previous Democratic president had been raised by a single mom and had lived on food stamps, just like J.K. Rowling was on welfare on her way to being in a position to pay millions of euros in taxes back into the system. And I think overall, if you just do the math, Obama and Bill Clinton and J.K. Rowling were a good bet. It was a good bet to go ahead and feed them, because they have paid back into the system. Whether you agree with their politics or like their literature, they have certainly been a good bet. The challenge for modern Americans, and I think because the church is certainly reflective of American values, it's a challenge for the modern church, is to not always see everything from the perspective of personal interest. Sure, indulge yourselves. We're not Puritans. We're not trying to deny you any satisfaction. Eat from the vineyard that you have planted. Enjoy the fruits of your labor. But just remember that you don't live alone, and that someone sacrificed to give you a chance in life, and there is another generation coming after you. Paul is reminding the church to think about their community. It's great that you've had a successful business. It's great that you were able to translate your IQ into advanced degrees. It's great that you've got a talent in art or music or carpentry. But Paul wants to tell you that you were not given that talent just to make you comfortable, just to feather your own nest. Not to, and I love this song by Paul Simon that we're going to hear soon. I guess Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, back when there were two of them in the Simon and Garfunkel, that we have tended our own gardens for far too long. And the song is a late night walk around a part of New York where there were drug dealers and prostitutes and people living on the street, and he becomes aware that in spite of all the good things in his own life, he's not really healthy while this many people are living in danger. And the line, "We have tended our own garden for far too long." I think that should be a refrain that comes back to the minds of North Americans over and over and over again. We need to help weed the gardens of others. We need to make our lives more of a community-focused life and less of a personally focused life. We've been so trained to always be afraid, and I think that's part of what I hate about politics and really about the whole gun trade industry, is that we've been trained to be scared, to always be afraid that we won't be able to personally make ends meet, that we won't survive the next economic downturn, that we might become unemployed, that we'll be unable to support ourselves. And some of those fears are real. I mean, those things actually happen, of course. But if we allow those fears to make us forget about our community, then you can almost guarantee that those things will happen. That if we become so focused on saving ourselves that we disregard the needs of others, we are creating the economy and the environment in which we will fail. The only thing that makes it possible for us to live a decent life is if we strive to make sure that the people around us are leading a decent life. Honestly, it's so disappointing to me to hear people in their rebellions against taxes where they would literally prefer to have 90% of a 4-inch pie than half of a 12-inch pie. They can't be satisfied if they think that somebody else is getting something for nothing. That the whole sense of, I'm not really happy with what I have unless you are suffering while I... That's a really sick way of thinking. We don't want to fund public health in the United States. We don't want to fund public education at an adequate level. We don't want to fund our state universities. We don't want to fund food stamp programs or public housing. But because we don't want to deal with these fundamental poverty issues, a large portion of our population, not literally, not figuratively, but literally, are being put in prison. Because we don't want to fund food stamps, we don't want to fund education, we don't want to fund housing, we don't want to fund universities. It's like trying to starve your left arm so you can feed and build up your right arm. It's impossible to accomplish. Poverty drives crime and addiction, and then crime and addiction drives up crime and the prison population, so that those people are then being taken out of productive tax-paying careers. Their children are becoming orphaned. They are being put back into the system for the most expensive forms of public assistance there is. Incarceration and the services then necessary to the children that they leave uncared for is radically more expensive than actually giving them an education and food and health care in the process of growing up. You could say amen. Mel's not here today, so okay, good, thanks. I was feeling a little lonely, so just help me out when you can. There are people in Great Britain right now who would like to cut the assistance that made it possible for J.K. Rowling to become an internationally famous author. And we have a lot of Americans that hold nothing but disdain for the welfare moms like the ones who raised Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. But whether you like either of those examples, they are people who have become productive members of society, who have paid back in taxes 1,000,000 times what they ever took out. I'm not saying anything that's really very complicated today. I'm just saying that you don't starve your left leg so that your right leg can be stronger and more healthy. As long as there is a hungry child in this city who goes to bed tonight without proper nutrition, as long as there is a senior citizen that has to decide between their pharmaceuticals and their groceries, as long as we as a society are willing to cast off under bridges and into cars and stairwells the people that we're not willing to put inside a house, then we are poisoning our own bodies. This is not a complicated spiritual idea, but it is a hard one to let sink in. So you can trust me to bring it up again. We are born selfish little pigs, but through worship, study, service, by practicing our faith, we can give birth to a new character defined by radical compassion. None of us are entirely there yet, but the good news is we've all got another week to work on it and get better at it.